A back massage, something so innocent, sparked a chain of events that no one saw coming. It started like any other evening, a son offering to help his mother, hoping to relieve her stress. But the moment his hands touched her shoulders, everything changed. His fingers gently pressed into her skin, but her response was unexpected. She froze. Then a tear fell. What could have triggered this sudden shift? Something was hiding beneath the surface. It started as a normal evening. The kind where everything feels routine, comfortable, and predictable. She sat there on the couch, glancing at the TV, while he was in the kitchen, putting together a quiet dinner. Their life had always been this way, calm, settled. But beneath the surface, something had changed. She could feel it, even if she couldn't explain it. It was in the air. In the way his eyes lingered just a little too long on the phone, in the way his words were carefully chosen, as if avoiding something unspoken. She couldn't put her finger on it, but something about tonight felt off. She had been carrying this weight for a while now, an invisible burden that pressed down on her chest every time she smiled, every time she pretended that everything was perfect. She thought she could ignore it. She thought it would pass like a fleeting moment of doubt. But with every passing day, it only grew heavier, gnawing at her from the inside. The truth, buried deep in her mind, kept her up at night. But tonight she couldn't hide from it any longer. Her eyes flickered toward him as he set the plates on the table. He didn't notice. Or maybe he did. Maybe he knew the tension in the room wasn't just her imagination. The unspoken words hung between them, thick and suffocating as they sat down to eat. She tried to smile, but the movement felt wrong, forced. She was so close to asking, so close to finally confronting him, but the words wouldn't come. Not yet. She wasn't ready. But she also knew deep down that the moment of truth was coming. It had to. It was inevitable. The lies she had buried, the betrayal she couldn't forget, would soon tear everything apart. Could she face it? Could they survive it? Or was this the moment everything would change forever? The last shred of innocence slipping through her fingers like sand. The question lingered in her mind, unanswered, as she stared at him. She couldn't decide what terrified her more, the truth she was hiding or the truth he was hiding from her. She had always been the rock of the family, the one who kept everything together, no matter the cost. As a mother, she had sacrificed so much: her dreams, her ambitions, her happiness. She'd always made sure her son, Daniel, was well taken care of, that he had everything he needed. From the outside, their relationship appeared perfect, close, loving, the typical mother-son bond that everyone admired. But beneath the surface there were cracks. Subtle ones at first, small things she brushed off, convinced they were just the natural distance that comes with time. But over the years the cracks had deepened, until it was hard to ignore anymore. Daniel, now in his late 20s, had grown distant. He wasn't the little boy who once sought her out for comfort or approval. It wasn't that he didn't care for her, she knew that much, but there was something about the way he carried himself now that spoke of a barrier she couldn't cross. He was polite, respectful, but there was always a coldness in his gaze, a look that seemed to say he was a stranger in his own home. And she couldn't help but wonder, was it her fault? Had she failed him in some way? She never talked about it, never allowed herself to truly reflect on the distance between them, but it gnawed at her. The years of raising him, of protecting him from everything, had it been enough? The weight of their unspoken words lingered between them. She would ask him how his day went, and he would give her short, clipped answers. When he visited, it was always on his terms, never staying long enough, never sharing enough. She was left wondering if their connection had always been built on a foundation of surface-level pleasantries, too afraid to dig into anything deeper. She longed for the days when he was a child, when she was his entire world. But now, it was as if he had slipped into another life, one where she didn't fit. And there were moments, brief but sharp, when she couldn't help but feel that something was missing, something that used to be there between them, but had faded into the background. It wasn't just the distance. There were the quiet moments of her own internal turmoil that seemed to mirror his. She had always been a woman of secrets, of unspoken thoughts that festered beneath her calm exterior. The memories of her own past her marriage, her infidelity haunted her. She had always promised herself she wouldn't bring that baggage into her relationship with Daniel, but some things were inevitable. Her mistakes, the guilt she carried, seeped into her every interaction with him. Could he sense it? Could he see the cracks in her that mirrored the ones in their relationship? For him, the distance was even harder to grasp. He never knew how to break through to her. He had always been sensitive, but as he grew older, he learned to shut off the emotions that made him vulnerable. It wasn't that he didn't love her, he did. He had always tried to show her that, in his own way. But there were things in his life that were left unsaid, feelings about his father, things that had always been pushed aside. His mother's affair, something he had discovered when he was a teenager, had been buried under layers of confusion and resentment. The anger he had felt then had never fully dissipated. It had colored the way he saw her, and though he had tried to move past it, it lingered. That betrayal, those secrets, had formed a wedge between them that neither had ever addressed. They both pretended it didn't exist, but deep down they knew it was there. The unspoken truth that had never been confronted. And now, on this quiet evening, he had come over to visit her, wanting to offer a small gesture, something as simple as a back massage to help her unwind. It seemed like a harmless, caring act, a way to break the tension that had settled in over the years. Yet, as his hands touched her shoulders, there was an odd stillness that settled between them. The moment felt heavier than it should have. He could feel her stiffen, and she could sense the way his hands lingered, hesitant, as if unsure of his next move. Was it just a back massage, or was there more to it? She could feel his touch differently now, just like she could feel the distance between them more sharply than before. She had spent so many years thinking about how they had drifted apart, wondering if it was all her fault. But now, as he stood behind her, massaging her shoulders, she was faced with an uncomfortable realization. Was the wedge between them something they could overcome? Or had the years of silence, of unresolved emotions, built a wall that was too high to tear down? Would this simple act of care become the trigger for something deeper? Something neither of them were truly ready to face. As the minutes ticked by, the room felt colder than it should have. Neither spoke. Neither moved. The past, the guilt, and the weight of everything they had never said hung heavily between them. And she couldn't help but wonder, would this moment, this simple family gesture, escalate into something that neither of them could ever take back? Would the truth finally come to light, forcing them both to confront the painful history they had tried so hard to ignore? The room was quiet, the only sound the soft hum of the air conditioning and the gentle press of Daniel's hands on her shoulders. It was a simple thing, really a gesture of care. He had offered it without hesitation, his voice calm and steady as he told her she looked tired, that he wanted to help. At first, she had welcomed it, feeling the warmth of his touch sink into her muscles, the knots from the long day slowly unwinding under his fingers. For a moment, she allowed herself to relax, letting the familiar scent of his cologne fill the space between them. He had always been a good son, attentive and considerate. She could feel the effort he was putting into this small act of kindness. It was easy to get lost in the tenderness of the moment, to let herself believe that everything between them was fine, that the years of silence, the unresolved tension, could be ignored for a little while longer. But as his hands moved, the touch felt different than she had expected. First, it was gentle, even comforting. His palms pressed against her back, working slowly in rhythmic circles, coaxing out the tension in her muscles. But there was a strange undercurrent to it, a heaviness that started to settle in. She couldn't quite place it, but something in the way he touched her felt too intimate, too lingering. His hands were warm, and yet, the heat between them didn't feel like the warmth of affection. It felt charged, as if it were laced with something else. She could feel herself beginning to stiffen. It was subtle at first, just a small tightening in her shoulders, a slight shift in her posture. She wanted to tell him to stop, to pull away before things got any stranger. But she couldn't. Her body betrayed her, lingering in the moment longer than she wanted. The stillness between them was thick now, not just from the quiet, but from the tension she could feel rising in her chest, twisting with every movement of his hands. Her mind raced. She tried to push the growing discomfort away, to convince herself that it was nothing, that she was overthinking it. But there was a part of her that couldn't ignore the way his touch seemed to stir something in her, something deeper, something she wasn't prepared to face. His fingers pressed harder now, working out the tension in her shoulders with more urgency. She should have felt grateful for his effort, but instead, she felt a surge of anxiety building in her stomach. It was the subtle shift in his hands that caught her off guard. Where they had once been gentle and caring, now they were more assertive, almost too forceful. It wasn't painful, not exactly, but it felt invasive in a way she couldn't quite explain. She felt his thumb press into a spot just beneath her shoulder blade, and for a moment she froze. A flood of memories crashed over her, memories she had buried deep, memories of things she had done that she could never take back. The affair, the betrayal, the lies she had told to cover it all up. The guilt that had clung to her for years now seemed to rise to the surface, as though his touch was pulling it out of her. Her breath hitched as she tried to focus on the present, on the moment. But the emotional weight of the past, the years of unresolved pain and regret, threatened to spill over. She squeezed her eyes shut, feeling the sting of tears just behind them. She wanted to pull away, to escape the sensation of his hands on her back, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. There was something strangely magnetic about it, something that kept her rooted to the spot. Her son's hands, pressing into her skin, felt like a lifeline and a threat all at once. Her mind raced in two conflicting directions. Part of her screamed for her to stop this before it went any further. This was wrong, wasn't it? It was just a back massage, nothing more. And yet, another part of her, a darker, more vulnerable part, found herself strangely drawn to it. She felt a deep ache in her chest, a need to be comforted in a way she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. She hadn't realized how much she craved this simple connection until it was happening, until she was finally receiving the care and attention she had longed for from him. As the massage continued, the room seemed to grow colder, the space between them more suffocating. She could feel the air shifting, thickening, as if it were pregnant with the unsaid things that had always been there, lurking beneath the surface. Her breath quickened, but she couldn't bring herself to pull away, to stop him. The thought of telling him to stop seemed impossible, as if saying the words would shatter the fragile moment they were sharing. And yet, she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep pretending everything was fine. Her emotions were a whirlwind: tension, guilt, longing, confusion, and in that moment, she felt exposed in a way she hadn't expected. She wasn't just a mother receiving a back massage from her son. She was a woman facing her own shame, her own buried truths, as his hands moved steadily over her skin, pushing her further into a place she didn't want to go. The moment was no longer simple. It was complicated, full of emotional undertones that neither of them had anticipated. She felt herself trembling slightly, her heart beating faster as her son's hands moved lower on her back, as though he were instinctively seeking out the tension that she had hidden from him, from herself for so long. It was in the deepest parts of her, the parts she had locked away, and suddenly, she could feel them all unraveling. The weight of her own secrets threatened to break free, and she wasn't sure if she could hold them in any longer. And yet, even as the discomfort grew, even as the walls inside her began to crumble, there was something else, something stronger than the fear. It was the pull of connection, the ache of wanting to be understood, to be cared for in a way she hadn't allowed herself to be for so many years. And as much as she wanted to stop it, as much as she knew she should, she couldn't deny that in that moment, she was closer to him than she had been in years. But the deeper question lingered, heavy in her mind. Could she trust this moment? Or would it only reveal the painful truth they both had been avoiding for so long? Her breath was shallow now, each inhale a struggle against the overwhelming emotions that threatened to rise to the surface. The back massage had started as a simple, caring gesture, but now it felt as though the room had closed in on her, suffocating her with its intensity. Daniel's hands, once gentle, now moved with more certainty, almost as though he were probing, searching for something. The warmth of his touch was no longer comforting. It felt invasive, pulling at threads of vulnerability she had kept hidden for so long. His fingers dug into her skin, pressing deeper into the muscle, and each press seemed to send a sharp pang of guilt through her chest. She wanted to pull away, wanted to stop him, but her body was frozen, caught between the urge to flee and the strange pull that kept her in place. Her mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. This was wrong, she knew that. Everything about it felt wrong. But at the same time, she couldn't deny the strange, almost desperate longing that swirled inside her. She hadn't realized how much she had missed being close to him, missed feeling needed by him. How long had it been since he had been this tender, this attentive? How long had it been since they had shared a moment like this, where the distance between them seemed to vanish, even if only for a second? As his hands continued to move, she could feel a knot of tension building in her chest. She had never allowed herself to fully confront the feelings of guilt that had haunted her for years. The affair, the lies, the way she had torn apart the family, those secrets had festered in her heart, silent and heavy. And now, as his hands glided over her back, those memories came rushing to the surface. She could almost hear her own voice in her head, repeating the lies she had told him when he was younger, pretending everything was normal, pretending that the betrayal never happened. But it did. And now, in this quiet moment, the truth felt like a weight that she could no longer carry. Her heart began to race. She couldn't breathe. The guilt was suffocating her, threatening to swallow her whole. But at the same time, something deeper was stirring, something she didn't want to acknowledge. It was a strange, uninvited feeling, and she hated herself for it. She hated that in the midst of the guilt, there was a flicker of need, of yearning that she couldn't shut off. She wanted to cry, to scream at him to stop, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she sat there, motionless, as his hands moved lower on her back, pushing into the very parts of her she had buried all these years. She felt his breath close to her ear, his proximity increasing with each movement, and suddenly, the air between them felt thick with something unspoken, something neither of them could name. His touch was still gentle, but there was a subtle shift in it, a change in his rhythm, like he was sensing the way she tensed, the way her body responded. His hands moved lower still, brushing against the side of her waist, and she could feel the tension between them stretching, growing more taut with every passing second. Her mind screamed at her to stop, to push him away, to end this before it went any further. But her body wasn't listening. She felt the pull of his hands, the heat of them against her skin, and the confusion only deepened. She could feel her pulse quicken, her skin prickling with a mix of fear and something else, something dangerous and raw. The distance between them, once so wide, was narrowing, but with each inch, each touch, it felt as though something was slipping out of her control. She wanted to pull away, but there was a part of her, an awful, desperate part, that didn't want him to stop. That didn't want this moment to end. Daniel, too, seemed to change in that moment. His touch, once soft and almost tentative, had taken on a new intensity. She couldn't tell if it was intentional, if he was aware of the shift in the atmosphere, but she could feel it. His hands moved with a kind of deliberation now, as though he were trying to reach something deeper, to pull something from her, though she wasn't sure if he knew what he was looking for. The change in him was subtle, but it was there, an unspoken tension in the way he held her, in the way his movements grew slightly more insistent. For a brief moment, their gazes met in the reflection of the living room window. She saw the flicker of something in his eyes, something that might have been tenderness, or maybe it was uncertainty. She couldn't tell. But whatever it was, it made her stomach churn with unease. Was he feeling the same thing? Was this just a moment of closeness for him, a chance to bond with his mother after years of distance? Or was he sensing something darker, something more complicated? Her own heart was pounding in her chest now, and every breath felt like a struggle against the rising tide of emotions. Her thoughts scrambled, fighting for control, trying to make sense of the storm inside her. She felt a rush of longing for a connection, for a love she had neglected, a desire to make things right, but at the same time, a deep fear settled in her bones. Fear that the boundaries between them were blurring, that this innocent act of care could spiral into something they would never be able to take back. As his hands moved up her spine, she felt a pang of something else. Something she couldn't name, something that didn't belong. The conflict inside her twisted painfully. She wanted to stop, but she also didn't. She wanted to scream at him to understand, to somehow undo the years of silence and pain that hung over them. But instead she sat there paralyzed as the moment stretched on, the weight of it bearing down on her. And as the seconds dragged by, it became clear to her. Everything was unraveling. The lies, the guilt, the unspoken truths, they were all coming to the surface. This simple, innocent moment had become something far more complicated, something neither of them could control. The room felt like it was closing in on her, the walls pressing in as her mind raced and her heart broke, knowing that this was the beginning of something she wasn't ready to face. Something dangerous. Something that could change everything. The days after that night felt heavy, as though the very air between them had thickened, weighed down by the unspoken. She tried to pretend nothing had changed, but the truth clung to her like a shadow, growing darker with every passing moment. Every time Daniel entered the room, the silence between them grew louder, more unbearable. She found herself avoiding his eyes, unable to meet the gaze that once brought her comfort. She couldn't bear to look at him, to see the confusion she was certain reflected in his eyes. The guilt twisted inside her, each breath a reminder of what had happened, of what had been allowed to linger too long in the space between them. In the moments when they were together, there was a palpable distance. She tried to talk to him, to act as though everything was normal, but her words felt hollow, her attempts at small talk falling flat. His responses were short, polite but distant, as though he too was trying to keep the space between them wide enough to protect them both from what had transpired. But neither of them could escape it. The tension, thick and suffocating, clung to every interaction. There were times when she would catch him looking at her from the corner of her eye. His gaze fleeting, as though he was trying to understand her in a way he never had before. His face was unreadable, a mask of calm that didn't quite match the emotion she could feel swirling beneath the surface. She had hoped that if they simply moved on, the moment would fade, but it hadn't. Instead, it lingered, the weight of it growing heavier with each passing hour. She spent her nights lying awake, replaying the events over and over in her mind. How had it gone so wrong? How had she let herself cross that line? The shame was suffocating, leaving her feeling as though she were drowning in her own mistakes. She couldn't escape the image of Daniel's hands on her back, the closeness, the tension. The tenderness, yes, but also the unspoken confusion that had settled in the space between them. What had they become? What had they shared in that moment, and was it something that could ever be fixed? Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face, that flicker of something that wasn't quite understanding, but something close to it. She knew that look. She had seen it before, but never like this. It was a mixture of worry and something else, something more vulnerable, something that had no place between a mother and her son. She had betrayed him, even if she hadn't meant to. And he, in his quiet way, had started to pull away, retreating into himself as he too wrestled with what had happened. The isolation between them grew, until even the smallest gestures of care felt strange, misplaced. He no longer stayed for long visits, and when he did, his time was short, filled with forced conversation that neither of them knew how to navigate. It wasn't just the silence. It was the weight of everything they had never said to each other. All those years of avoiding the real conversations, the things neither had dared to confront, now hung between them like an insurmountable wall. The affair, the lies, the things that had never been fully addressed, had been pushed deeper into the shadows. But now, in the wake of that one unintentional moment, they could no longer hide. They had both seen the cracks, and neither knew how to fix them. And then there were the moments when she felt him watching her. His gaze lingering just a little too long, as though he were searching for something in her face, something he couldn't quite name. It made her heart ache, made her want to pull him close, but she couldn't. She had lost the ability to bridge the gap between them, and lost the courage to face what had happened. She knew that he, too, was drowning in confusion. How could he not be? The line between what was appropriate and what wasn't had blurred so completely that neither of them knew what was left. His quiet distance was just as painful as her own. She knew he felt it too. A shift. Change. And yet neither of them dared to acknowledge it, too afraid that doing so would make it real, would make the truth undeniable. They had become strangers in their own home. Each day she watched him, trying to read his face, to understand the thoughts he was hiding from her. But it was as if he had built a wall around himself, something impenetrable, something she couldn't break through. She longed to reach him, to make everything right, but she had no idea where to start. No words seemed enough to fix the fracture between them. For Daniel, it was the confusion that gnawed at him, that kept him awake at night. The act itself hadn't felt wrong at first, but the aftermath had been suffocating. The silence, the way his mother had recoiled from him, the distance that seemed to grow with every word he spoke, it all felt wrong, but he couldn't articulate why. He had tried to convince himself that it was just a simple moment, a misstep that would fade with time, but it didn't. He couldn't ignore the way his mother had stiffened under his touch, the way her eyes had closed, as if she were hiding something, as if there were things between them that were better left unsaid. He wanted to reach out to her to ask if she was okay, but he didn't know how. How could he? How could he confront the unspoken, when every word felt like a risk of opening something they both weren't ready to face? He had begun to pull away from her, the one person who had always been his anchor, because he feared what would happen if he got too close again. He feared that if he let himself feel too much, if he allowed the connection to deepen, he might uncover something that would change everything between them. And so, they both drifted in the silence. There were no more long talks, no more laughter over dinner. There was only the shared knowledge that something had broken, something that might never be fixed. She wanted to tell him everything, to admit her guilt, to explain what had happened, but the words wouldn't come. The shame was too much. And so, they both carried the weight of the unsaid, each of them retreating further into themselves, unable to reach the other, both isolated by the emotional storm that neither of them knew how to navigate. The distance between them had become an unspoken chasm, and every time they tried to bridge it, the gulf seemed only to widen. She sat alone in the quiet of the house, the weight of the past few weeks pressing heavily on her chest. The silence between her and Daniel was no longer just a gap, it had become a canyon. She had hoped that time would heal the distance, that eventually the awkwardness would fade, but it hadn't. The damage had already been done, and there was no erasing the look in his eyes, the way he avoided her gaze now. The touch, once innocent and full of care, had shifted something deeper within them both, something neither of them could name, but that they both felt. She had betrayed him, in a way that went far beyond physical boundaries. She had exposed the fragility of their relationship, the unresolved grief and guilt they had both tried to bury. She knew there would be no easy resolution, no simple way to fix what had been broken. There was no magic moment where everything would be okay again. The truth was, she had crossed a line, perhaps not in the way others might judge, but in a way that had irreparably altered the dynamic between mother and son. She couldn't undo the hurt, couldn't take back the awkwardness that lingered in every conversation. And as much as she longed to restore what they once had, she realized that it was gone, perhaps forever. The emotional toll was unspoken but evident in every interaction, in every strained silence. What struck her most was the weight of her own choices, how even the smallest gesture, something that seemed so innocent at the time, could unravel so much. The moral consequences were not just about the touch, they were about the emotional walls that had been built, the years of unspoken truths and the consequences of avoiding them. She couldn't escape the fact that she had carried her own unacknowledged guilt for far too long. And now, it had affected the one person who meant the most to her. As she stared out the window, watching the fading light of day, she realized that there were no easy answers, no quick fixes. The rift between them would take time to heal, if it ever did. She couldn't force him to forgive her, and she couldn't expect things to return to the way they had been. The complexity of human emotions, of longing, guilt, and unspoken pain, had tangled their lives in ways she hadn't understood before. And perhaps the most painful realization of all was that some things could never be fixed. Some fractures ran too deep to mend. She didn't know what the future held for their relationship. Maybe they would find a way back to each other, or maybe they wouldn't. But in that moment, she understood one thing clearly: nothing was ever truly simple. And as she sat with her guilt, her confusion, and the remnants of the bond she had once taken for granted, she knew that the road ahead would be filled with far more questions than answers. As his hands moved across her back, what started as comfort began to shift into something else, something neither of them could fully understand. But was it just a moment of closeness, or was something much darker rising to the surface? She wanted to speak, to break the silence before it swallowed them both, but the words wouldn't come. If she acknowledged what was happening, would she be able to face the consequences? Their eyes met for a fleeting second, and in that gaze was something unspoken, something fragile and dangerous. Had they already crossed a line, or was it only in their minds? The room felt smaller now, the weight of unsaid words pressing down on them. If she pulled away, would it all disappear, or would that only confirm the truth neither of them wanted to admit? In the days that followed, every conversation felt like walking on a tightrope, the distance growing with each step. Could they ever return to what they were, or had they forever changed into something they could never take back? She told herself it was just a mistake, a misunderstanding, but deep down she knew better. Would time heal this wound, or had it left a scar neither of them could erase? Have you ever found yourself trapped between what's right and what feels comforting, even when you know it's wrong? What do you do when the guilt of a mistake lingers, and you can't take it back? Can a single moment change everything in a relationship, even if it was unintentional? How do you move forward when the line between love and betrayal becomes blurred? Have you ever avoided the truth because facing it seemed too painful? When does the weight of unspoken words become too much to bear? What would you do if you found yourself in a situation like this, where the line between love and guilt starts to blur? Share your thoughts in the comments. How would you handle this kind of emotional conflict? In the end, it's not always the big mistakes that tear relationships apart, but the small moments that go unspoken. How do we navigate the space between love, guilt, and forgiveness, when sometimes there is no clear answer?